I spent 22 years active duty service in the United States Army. From June of 2005 to November of 2007, I spent those 2.5 years in Kandahar, Afghanistan, working as a senior advisor to the Afghan National Army in conjunction with the United States Army and also NATO forces taking care of the southern region. But before I begin, there are three basic quotes that I want to share with you that I think apply to what's going on in Afghanistan. The first one comes from Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu, who said, "To know your enemy and to know yourself and to know the terrain or the environment in countless amounts of battles, you will always be victorious." The second quote came to me from a retired Marine First Sergeant by the name of Jim Reifinger, who once taught me, if you ever find yourself in a fair fight, it is because your tactics suck. And then the last quote is something I think that we all need to pay attention to. And this was something that I taught my soldiers when I was in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. And that is, the reality of your enemy must, or eventually will, become your own. And I think that's one of the big problems that we have right now when we look at Afghanistan, is we have a denial of the enemy that we're fighting against. And we have a denial of how do we confront him. So I spoke with Dr. Faris, and what I want to try to do and set the stage for him as he comes up, I want to talk about from the tactical level up to the operational and strategic level, how we need to have a meshing of tasks to make sure we are properly prosecuting this thing called a war on terror. The first thing that you have to look at, and General Cavazos, I don't know if those of you may remember him, but he commanded every level from the platoon all the way up to Forces Command, retired as a 4-star general. Anytime he evaluated a combat commander, Cavazos would ask this very simple question: is your operation enemy-oriented or is your operation terrain-oriented? And the big difference between that is, thereby goes, what do you focus on as far as your task to be accomplished? And tactical and strategic and operational tasks are so important. See, one of the things that we understand down at the tactical level of the fight is that we have 5 basic tasks that we have to accomplish. You must first find the enemy. You must fix him in position. You must engage him with your weapon systems. You must destroy him, and then you must pursue him. United States military forces will never lose at the tactical level because we understand what has to happen. But where we always seem to find a problem is when we go from that tactical to the middle level, which is called the operational level, and then, of course, up to the strategic level. And if you listen to what is being said for quite some time, and you understand we've been at this for 8 years now, when have we ever heard someone definitively say, what are the strategic level goals and objectives in prosecuting this thing called a war on terror? What are the operational level goals and objectives? See, the first thing we fail to understand is that Afghanistan is not a war in and of itself. Neither was Iraq a war in and of itself. We have a war against an Islamic totalitarian enemy, which is political, it is informational, it is military, and is also economic. And we're not using all of our elements of national power to prosecute him at that strategic level. Some of the things that I think we should be looking at the strategic level, if we focus properly on being enemy-oriented and not terrain-oriented, because when you are terrain-oriented, then you become an army of occupation. You become more so concerned about holding land, and you lose focus on the enemy. And I'll tie that up at the end. What we need to look at doing, first and foremost, we have to deny this enemy a sanctuary wherever he seeks to establish himself. We're not doing that. We also need to interdict his flow of men, materiel, financial support. That's a key strategic and operational task. The third thing, we need to understand how we cordon off certain areas of operation that we're in, being it in Iraq or being it in Afghanistan. You almost have to put a bubble around these areas to keep these influences out. And then the last thing that we have to do from a strategic and operational level, we must win the information operation. We have to influence this enemy. And we have to understand that the true power in these places like Iraq and Afghanistan and in the Islamic world is not with leaders such as a Mahmoud Ahmadinejad or with a Hamid Karzai. The true power lies with the mullahs, the clerics, and the imams. You know, I had a great discussion when I was over in Afghanistan with a State Department official, and I said, why don't we, on these Afghan military bases that we're building, put radio stations there so that we can start broadcasting messages out? Because as you know, in Afghanistan, you have about a 90% plus overall illiteracy rate. But they listen to music, and they listen to the radio. And how better to combat against the Taliban and what they're doing than to get your message out there and get it out there with Afghan soldiers that are serving their country and develop some sense of pride. And the person looked at me and he said, well, I think that probably would be too hard. We probably wouldn't be able to get that to broadcast all over the country. And I said, well, what you need to understand is over in Helmand province, the British have a radio station that broadcasts all over southern Afghanistan. Something simple as that we're missing out on that will help us to win that information operation. Another thing that we need to look at, the poppies. The heroin trade is the #1 means by which the Taliban is getting their financial support. Now, a lot of people are talking about how we're doing poppy eradication over in Afghanistan, but let me tell you what's actually going on. It is elimination of the competition, because there are certain poppy fields that don't get touched in Afghanistan. And everyone that was in southern Afghanistan knew one thing. We knew that Hamid Karzai's brother was the #1 drug dealer in southern Afghanistan, the #1 drug lord. And his fields never got touched. Now, think about this. If you're a farmer here in the United States of America, and you're just trying to earn a living, and someone comes in and plows up your field and takes away your livelihood, is that person pretty much so endeared to you, or do you start to see that person as an enemy? The Taliban has taken poppy eradication and turned it against us by going in and providing security to these farmers, taking the poppy, and then going out and selling it. These farmers don't care who they sell it to. They just want to live. We should be providing some type of security, and then going in, we can buy this up, we can burn it, we can seek to convert it into morphine or something, but we cannot allow this crop to continue to fall into the hands of the Taliban, which of course they in turn use for men and materiel and monies. One of the other things that we have to start looking at that is effective from the strategic level down to the tactical level is the rules of engagement. My nephew just got back from Afghanistan. It was his second assignment 2 weeks ago. And the rules of engagement have been so terribly drawn up now that we are allowing the enemy to pin down our forces before we will bring in, and as I said, engage with all available weapon systems. The Taliban knows what we will and what we will not do. I'll give you a great example. You go outside the gate of Kandahar Air Base, and you will have people that are sitting right outside the gate that are watching convoys, that are counting, but you can't engage them because they don't have weapons, and therefore they're not conveying any hostile intent. I was at an outpost up in Zabul province, and we were getting mortar fire, and we looked up on the hills, and we saw a guy with binoculars. Now, I don't think that gentleman was bird watching. But the thing is, the rules of engagement would not allow our soldiers to engage that person standing up there doing what we call in the military being a forward observer, because he did not have weapons and he was not displaying a hostile intent. At that strategic level decision, the ROE is restricting our soldiers from properly engaging this enemy and defeating him. Once again, we're creating a sanctuary for him to gain intelligence on us and bring fires against us. What was the beginning of trouble that I saw brings along this situation we have right now? Back in 2006, if you remember, when Pervez Musharraf and also Lieutenant General Richards, who was the commander of the NATO forces at that time, drew up an agreement whereby the Pakistani army pulled out of the Northwest Frontier Provinces area. We call it Waziristan. As soon as we did that, we saw everything come into that mountainous area. And of course, the attacks spiked monumentally in southern Afghanistan. We have to stop creating a sanctuary for this enemy, and we have to reach out and we have to attack him wherever he presents himself. A lot of people are talking about more men going into Afghanistan. I don't think that's the exact answer to it. We can use more predators. We can use attack helicopters, which are a very powerful tool in that mountainous type of terrain, fixed-wing aircraft, but we have to be able to track this enemy and bring those systems to bear. One of the great systems we have is a surface-to-surface systems called the Multiple Launch Rocket System, HIMARS, which is something that I commanded. We have the capability to put a missile 300 kilometers within a ±5 circle error of probable. We can do these things. We just need to understand at the strategic level what are the goals and objectives. Another thing that hurts us over in Afghanistan, if you go up to NATO headquarters, there's a big book up there called the NATO Caveats. It details what the member nations will and will not do. And a great example of that was when we turned over the entire Zabul province to the Romanian army. The Romanian army did not answer to the NATO commander in southern Afghanistan. They answered back to the Ministry of Defense in their home country. And their direction from the Ministry of Defense was that you will not get off the roads and go up into the high ground. If we had fought World War II the same way that we're fighting in Afghanistan, a whole lot of people would be speaking German right now. The Dutch are in Uruzgan province. They won't coordinate with the British over in Helmand province. The Canadians who are in Kandahar province don't have all the material to properly fight against the Taliban and do the type of patrolling along the Pakistani border because they don't have rotary wing aircraft, they don't have fixed wing aircraft. That is the problem. It's not about more men. It's about the proper resourcing and utilization of the weapon systems that we have. So what do I say we need to do? The first thing is this. We should have been focused on security and the enemy before we got involved into the political aspect. And I'm sure Dr. Faris will agree with me on this point. That is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. In Islam, secular government is not regarded. All laws, everything that governs them comes from the Quran, and it comes from Allah. If you are talking about establishing a democracy in an Islamic republic, you're talking about going against the very nature and the very principles by which Muslims live their lives. That goes back to what Sun Tzu said. That's something that we need to understand at the strategic level. Schools being open are a great thing, but at night, the Taliban comes in and destroys those schools. If we cannot provide the security, young girls will still be gunned down when they walk away from those schools. And I want to close by saying once again, the war on terror is a worldwide conflagration. It is not restricted to any certain country or any certain theater of operation. And if we do not start developing the goals and objectives at that strategic level, bringing it down to the operational level, and tying it into what our soldiers, our men, women, airmen, Marines are doing on the ground, we're going to follow along the same suit that we saw in Vietnam. And ladies and gentlemen, we cannot afford to lose to this enemy because this has been a fight that has been going on since 622 AD, and they're not going to give up. So thank you very much for having me, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Comments or questions for Colonel West?
The joint forces issue that you raised.
Yes, ma'am.
And also even some of those forces not reporting to NATO, obviously the coalition management issue is huge.
It's huge.
What's being done on that?
Well, and it's not the joint forces, because joint forces is for us, Army, but what you're talking about is combined warfare. And as I said, the thing is right now, all of those countries, like I said, in southern Afghanistan, a great example is each province in southern Afghanistan is under the control of a separate country. The Canadians have Kandahar province, the Brits have Helmand, the Dutch had Uruzgan, the Romanians had Zabul province. I think the Spaniards and the Italians were up in Herat province and Nimroz. And there is no concerted effort to work together as far as supporting each other in operations. So what the enemy ends up doing is finding, I'm going to go where I have the path of least resistance. And that's where I establish myself, and then I'll launch attacks elsewhere because we're not coordinating very well. And the problem with that is it starts with NATO. And it starts with the fact that these member nations are not responding back to the commander on the ground. They're responding back to their separate ministries of defense. Prime example, let's say on D-Day, you had the Canadians, you had the Brits, you had the French, you had the Americans. They were not responding back under the command and control of General Eisenhower. They were responding back to each one of their different and separate and respective countries. And that's one of the critical things that we have to resolve. Because right now, until we get the NATO forces fighting under the commander that is there and get rid of this caveat book that sits up in Kabul, the enemy will continue to find the sanctuary where he can hide out and he can launch his attacks. And be very wary of what's going to start coming down out of the northern countries, being at Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. Because once again, up there in the northern part of Afghanistan, we have the Germans there. They're not getting out and they're doing, they're not very active. I'll put it that way. And so once again, when you come back and I talked about that operational perspective of cordoning off this area, that's not what's happening. We have a very, very porous border over there. And I went down to Spin Boldak, and I looked across into Chaman, Pakistan. And you can see the Taliban walk around openly in their black garb with their AK-47s. No control over the border crossing at Spin Boldak.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about the presidential elections in Afghanistan and how they impact the war? And also in our country, since everyone's saying the president is good on Afghanistan by sending in more, whatever he's doing, yet he's doing just the opposite of what you were saying with, I think I lost the sound on this, but doing just the opposite of what you were saying in terms of naming the enemy.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing. That's what goes back to my quote about the reality of your enemy must or eventually will become your own. And for us to sit back and say there is no war on terror, there is no enemy, you're just putting your head into the sand. And when you do that, you expose a certain part of your anatomy. A very key thing that has to happen is this. We have to understand the clannish nature of Afghanistan. You are never going to have a successful election in Afghanistan. You're just not. And we need to understand that. And you already see the problems that's coming out right now because the Pashtuns don't like the Tajiks, don't like the Uzbeks, and the poor little Hazaras are beaten up by everybody. How are you going to try to pull together a country that, you study its history, has never had an effective central government? The first thing you have to do has to be security-oriented. And that goes back to the enemy orientation, not the terrain orientation, not the nation-building orientation. I think the biggest thing, the mistake that we did, we want to see everyone in rose-colored Western civilization-type glasses. And we don't understand that there are some places in the world where the strong man rules. And Afghanistan is one of them. Nobody has conquered those people. And if we think that we can come in and winning hearts and minds, that's not a strategic task. It sounds very good, but it's not something that tribal leaders respect. A little anecdote. When the Canadians first got down to southern Afghanistan, they told us they were going to do things all different from how the Americans had done it. And of course, all of us who had been there for quite some time just kind of snickered. There was a Canadian major that went up into a village and decided that he was going to show how kind and gentle he was, and he took off his helmet. And he was talking to tribal leaders and what have you. And in no time flat, he had an axe that was planted into his head. This is the level of people that we're dealing with over there. And if we don't start understanding what they see, what they believe as far as winning hearts and minds, the Taliban and the people that are over there, they're going with whoever they think has the upper hand. If we show that we have the upper hand, they'll act right. That was the exact same thing that 45 Sunni sheiks told me in 2003 in Iraq as a battalion commander.
May I interrupt, because we will spend the entire time we have